So even very early on, I had parents asking me if I could come home with them because their kids were so relaxed when they would leave therapy sessions. And I have to say, as a therapist, it was the most addicting therapy I have ever learned and participated in because, as therapists, we're so used to everything taking so much time. And it still does. Neural connections take time to create. But with the cranial work, I could have somebody come in and they could leave visibly changed in a better way.
Hi, welcome back to Mother's Guide Through Autism podcast. I'm Bridget Shipman, and I'm your host. Today, I'm going to be speaking with Dr. Sally Fryer Dietz. Dr. Sally is the founder and director of Integrative Pediatric Therapy and Integrative Concussion Therapy. Integrative Pediatric Therapy focuses on children with learning differences and other developmental disabilities. Using a unique blend of mainstream and complementary therapies, including sensory integration and craniosacral therapy, patients consistently demonstrate overall improvement in function and quality of life. Sally lectures and teaches nationally and internationally on sensory integration, developmental therapy, craniosacral therapy, concussion rehabilitation, and the efficacy of combining traditional and alternative treatment methods for each individual. Dr. Sally has written a book, and she has sensory solutions available on Amazon. She also wrote her first book in 2015, When Kids Fly. These books focus on solutions for children with sensory integration challenges. In her book, she shares over 30 years of experience as a lead sensory integration specialist and her own personal journey as a mother of a child with learning differences. Sally has double degrees in child development and physical therapy and received her doctorate in pediatric physical therapy from the University of Texas Medical Branch. She's also certified in sensory integration practice testing and has technique and diplomate certifications in craniosacral therapy through the Upledger. Welcome, and thank you for joining us, Dr. Sally. I hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome, Dr. Sally. It is quite an honor to have you on Mother's Guide Through Autism. So welcome.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so I am really looking forward to this interview because we did a little bit of chatting before I hit the record button. And I believe that what we're going to be talking about today, the therapies, your book, some of the great work that you've done in our community is really going to help a lot of people. So I would just like to start out with just you briefly telling us about how you came to do what you do.
Well, as most of you out there listening probably know, our children are our greatest teachers. And even though I've always been in pediatrics for over 40 years, it wasn't until I had my first son and he was 5 and wasn't doing things the same way that some of his classmates were, that I was prompted to actually open my own clinic to help kids like him and other children who were bright, precocious in their own way, who like to do things their own way, but just, maybe needed a little bit help in how they presented to the world. So anyway, he's who guided me to do all the things that I do even still to this day and continue to learn about. He's 37 now and a dad of 2 kids and a very successful attorney. So they do grow up, and there can be happy endings, but we want to give our kids as many options as they can have to be able to find their own way. And especially when they're young, it can be really hard to negotiate what that is.
I agree. I coach so many mothers, and that they can be anywhere on the journey, on the autism journey, but particularly the beginning is really daunting. I know it was for me.
It really is, because you don't know, you have these dreams and expectations, and when your child isn't quite fitting into what those are, it's confusing. You don't know, and it's different being a therapist as it is being a mom. And I really wrote my book for moms and teachers and pediatricians and other professionals who worked with children from a mom's perspective as well as a therapist perspective, and kind of merge those two worlds together, because even I couldn't be my own child's therapist. It's a different relationship, and we see things differently. We're our kids' champions, and sometimes we interpret the world a little bit too much for them, when they're struggling and having trouble. So it can be hard sometimes to sort out, when a child really does need help, and what does that help look like?
Yeah, we're going to break it down. So for anyone who's listening, and I agree, we're teaching through our stories, not just other parents, but also in the professional realm of it, because I know I'm a former educator. I'm still an educator, so, but you know what I mean, in the system. And what I notice is that that hasn't changed much. So when I went and got my degree, and even when I'm later to get my master's degree, they didn't talk about autism or really include how, as a teacher in classroom management, how do you really create an inclusive classroom? So I think it's really important to have these conversations to help everybody really understand our kids a lot better.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Yeah. So when you, at the beginning, so let's kind of start there with the struggles that you encountered. What is some wisdom that you gained? Because you didn't go just from, yes, my child is 37, he's successful, there is a happy ending, which, yes, this is all about it. This is all about inspiration. I do hope, inspiration, and knowledge, right?
Yeah.
But there's a big gap there.
Right.
So at the beginning of your story with your child, what's some of the wisdom you can share with our listeners?
Well, you know, my experience, of course, as a mom, when this little guy was 5, I just thought I loved everything he did, how he approached the world. He it, he memorized biological names of all the fish in the in the fish book, and I mean, he just did things that were unique and like fun, to watch and observe. But when his teacher, said how he didn't like to write, or he didn't want to do math, and he didn't want to do what they wanted him to do, I'm like, what? I couldn't imagine. But I listened, and what I came to realize is that very often, it's the teachers who see things that we sometimes don't, because we get to interact with our kids when they're most relaxed. They're at home, they feel safe, they feel comfortable, and we get to see, all the fun, kind of sometimes quirky little things that they do. But the teachers, they're the ones who have a whole classroom of children. And if you really, think about it, and we look at what autism is, it's just a description of somebody on a spectrum that all of us fall on. So you could say we're all a little bit autistic, really in reality, because we all have to make sense of the world. We all fall on the spectrum of sensory integration and how we interpret things from our environment. And, you know, a label is just a label, but how you integrate that information and how you find, again, help and support, for kids, sometimes those labels can be can be helpful, to get the kind of services that you need. But I think, just knowing that we all are on the spectrum and we all have opportunities to kind of make things a little bit easier and to move up that spectrum, even just a little bit, or maybe it's a lot, just to be able to make sense of the world a little bit easier. And where I was really coming from early on, my child, I took him to the pediatrician as recommended, and they recommend he go on medication. And I was married to a physician at the time who also was very left brain and wanted him to try this medication as well. So we put him on the medication, which I really wasn't comfortable with. And he was very focused, but he completely shut down. All the joy that, I used to see in him, it just wasn't there. And I wasn't comfortable with that. So I took him to another doctor, a developmental pediatrician this time. And he said, well, he's depressed. And he was depressed because the stimulant medicine was making him depressed. And so they added, an antidepressant to his little cocktail of things. And, it didn't, he still was, he was focused, but it just wasn't the same. I don't think he felt very good. And he would tell you today that the medicine made him feel terrible. So then I took him to a third, second opinion with an educational tester who recommended we change schools. And he was actually very, his teacher was very supportive, and he was in a Montessori school and it was working out great for him in school. And so I wasn't really comfortable with that. And it just made me just want to find more, what was the magic ingredient? And I was new to Dallas at the time, and there was nobody who did sensory integration therapy, which is what I had been trained in out in California before I moved to Texas. And so I began, looking for ways to help support him off of medication. And I was able to do that and create an environment for him as well as other children who had similar kinds of issues. And it really has made a huge, huge difference in so many kids' lives. It's not just, quirky kids who do things a little bit differently, but the whole spectrum of developmental issues that we see. And, all kids, all individuals, even if you don't have any kind of a diagnosis, are going to do better when you have an environment that supports your sensory systems. If you look at how kids grow and develop in a healthy way, it's, being able to get outside and play and interact with things and swing and, motor plan, learn new motor skills and all that stuff. But some kids have a hard time doing that. So how do we, help support kids to get there? So that was kind of a long answer to a very,
No, it's good. No, that's great. It's a great answer, because I think, there's so many people who listen to this podcast that are, like I said earlier, that are in all areas of the journey, right? They're in different stages. And so for those that are listening that are new to this, how would you explain sensory integration?
So sensory integration it really is a term that describes how you have to grow and develop. All of us have sensory systems. We think of, sight and hearing and taste and kind of the primary, five that we're, taught in school. But there are three sensory systems that are really critical for learning and development. And those are the vestibular system, which taps into your motor planning and how you perceive movement and, put things together. It's also related to your speech and language. So you think about kids who have trouble with processing language and social skills and all that. That's a big vestibular component. Then there's also the proprioceptive component that has to do with the joint receptors in your body. So, when you're sitting in your chair, if you close your eyes, it's your proprioceptive system that tells you where you are. And that system's always working for us behind the scenes, telling us where our body is in space. So it's really critical for integrating with your vestibular system so that you can sit in a chair and be able to control writing with a pencil or be able to focus on a teacher who's trying to tell you something. And then the third sensory system that's so important for learning and development is your tactile system. So how you process touch, both light touch, deep touch, and perceived touch. You know, how many kids are in a line and they perceive somebody being too close to them or something, you know, getting in the way of that touch. Maybe somebody brushes up against them, and so their reaction is to push and, you know, hit them or to get out of line. And now they're the troublemaker, you know, that is, you know, getting more in trouble. So those three sensory systems, if you think of them like in a, you know, triangle pyramid, they all have to interact with each other and balance each other out. So if you have one sensory system that's over, you know, active or underactive, those other two sensory systems are going to have to compensate somehow to balance for them. And it can get, you know, if you're a child growing and developing in school and you have trouble getting those systems to work well for you, it makes it very hard to focus and pay attention.
Mhm.
And, you know, so many of the kids that we see, that's why they come into the clinic in the first place, is that somebody has said, this child is not paying attention. And the first thing they want to do is put them in a category that requires a medication to help them make, you know, pay attention.
Mhm.
And you can do that with neurostimulators. You know, I mean, it may work for a little while, but it takes away their ability to create those neural pathways themselves. So doesn't it make more sense to start, especially with our very young kids, with ways to help open up those sensory systems so they can make better sense of the world first? And then down the road, if you have trouble with attention or something else is really getting in the way, you've already given them a good foundational support where, you know, you can look at that kind of thing a little bit more, maybe effectively. And maybe you don't even need it at all. And a lot of times in our experience, well, our kids don't need to be medicated, you know, down the road. It's a quick fix that some people, you know, choose to do, but very rarely is at the end of the game. You get a, you know, a pill and you're happy ever after. It's usually doesn't work quite right after a couple of months. Kids are growing and doses get, you know, it becomes a cocktail game of,
Mhm.
you know, which combination of things is going to work the most. So the, you know, the more time you can buy really supporting a child's nervous system on the front end, in my opinion, it's better for that child. Certainly was better for my child.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because as you were explaining all that, I of course go right to my son and our experiences and what a struggle he had, it sounds like in all three of those areas, right? And how bringing that together. And I mean, I mean, you would now people would say, oh, you never know it,
Mm,
but he still struggles with expressive language. And so then I start thinking about the brain, right?
right.
And I know that you do, there's so much more that we know about the brain now than I did when Joseph was diagnosed in the 90s. But can you explain to us what the craniosacral therapy is? And if I mispronounce that, please correct me.
Yeah,
How
that's
does it work?
you're completely correct. CranioSacral Therapy, or CST, as
Uh-huh.
you know, we like to call it. It's a great manual therapy that really helps to support the nervous system so that you can take advantage of all these other therapies that are available to you. When I first learned about it, it was in 1995. And I had started my clinic in 1994, and somebody told me how there was this treatment that she was using in her clinic that really was great for children with autism. And I thought, well, you know, I don't know how this light touch is going to help autistic children, but I'm going to go find out more about it so I can tell people why I don't think it will work rather than how it could work. You know, this was the, you know, my left brain scientific upbringing to become, a physical therapist working with kids. And I went to that first class and I came back thinking, I don't know what this is, but there is definitely something to it. And from there, it led me on a path that really has changed our practice dramatically, because it has been found to be so effective in working with kids with all different kinds of developmental disabilities, in really helping to support their nervous systems to be more receptive to lots of other treatments that are available to them. If you think about a lot of the problems that our kids struggle with have a foundation in anxiety, or they cause anxiety. And it's the anxiety that gets in the way of, wanting to participate socially, or wanting to, do something that's a little bit too hard for them or whatever. And the craniosacral therapy is great at just helping to reduce that anxiety without medication and set the individual up, no matter what age, for just being able to interact more. Well, if you can interact more and you can get those experiences into your nervous system, you have a much better opportunity to develop those neural connections yourself. So it's a win-win. It's not invasive. It's not a forced touch. It's a very light touch manual therapy, meaning we use our hands over clothes. We meet kids where they are, not just, they don't have to lay on a table and be still to do anything. People say, how do you ever, work with, a child who's moving all over the place? Well, we move with the child all over the place. I use a lot of swings. We have a big boat swing, and I'm able to sit on the swing with the child, and they get the movement. That vestibular system is, getting their bodies to relax in a certain way. And I can have my hands where I need to be to help work with that cranial system while I'm feeding that sensory system, calming the nervous system, and everything just starts to fall into place. So even very early on, I had parents asking me if I could come home with them, because their kids were so relaxed when they would leave therapy sessions. And I have to say, as a therapist, it was the most addicting therapy I have ever learned and participated in, because, as therapists, we're so used to everything taking so much time. And it, it still does. Neural connections take time to create. But with the cranial work, I could have somebody come in and they could leave visibly changed in a better way. And it's a great feeling to, be able to help support families that way.
Yeah, that is wonderful. I think about, like, if I'm listening to this and I'm new to autism, my child's just diagnosed, and the anxiety, moms are anxious too, right? It's a very, very scary thing to begin. So is this a therapy that you would begin with? I mean, because I get these questions all the time.
So it really varies. When we do an evaluation, the first thing we want to do is we want to see, what's going on with this child? How do they interact with the environment? Are they really anxious and shut down? Do they come in, look like, a little deer in the headlights, or are they completely, just risk takers and run into the room and go crazy and are jumping all over the place? A lot of it really depends on how they interact initially. And sometimes I'll recommend we start with the sensory integration therapy if they have a lot of sensory needs that need to be calmed down first. Plus, it's so child-centered that a child who's, already kind of trying to get that sensory input in, but just not organized about it, so they can't, get it loaded in the best way, they're gonna become more engaged faster if they can have that kind of experience on the front end. Whereas, other kids who might be a little bit more anxious and timid and have a lot of separation anxiety or something else, it might be better to start out with the craniosacral therapy, and maybe the parent is even in the room when we're working with them on doing the cranial work, until we can get to a point where they feel safe enough to separate from the parent.
Mm.
It's really interesting. I was just speaking of parent involvement. One of the things that we find, and even with my own son and having it be my own clinic, kids will do better from a sensory motor perspective if their parents aren't there in the room telling them what to do or interpreting the world for them. And it
Mm.
can be really hard when you're really feel you're a little bit of an overprotective parent. Not that that's not warranted, certainly in many different situations, but in a therapy situation, we want kids to start trying to do things on their own, and it's really hard to do that when your parents there telling you what to do. Otherwise, we're reinforcing the parent needing to help do that. In the craniosacral therapy, though, it's really nice to have parents there. Sometimes we'll even work with the parent and the child. Sometimes if we have a child who's really avoidant with touch, we might start with the parent. You have many more options to work with that combination, and the parent needs to be able to trust the therapist as well.
Mhm.
So it's a good place to start for many kids. But again, there is no one right way with any child. Every child is different. You can't go someplace that has a protocol for every child. This is not traditional therapy in the sense that you have problem with your knee and you have the same exercises that you do every time. It's just we're working with a developing nervous system, and every single child is different in how they are doing that. So we want to figure out, where do we need to meet them to be able to get those needs met and help them the most.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The nervous system and the anxiety pieces. And I often tell moms, and I was there too. I don't say I wasn't for sure because I was in that club too. But when you're anxious or nervous, I mean, I really could tell thinking back now that I was creating more anxiety for my son's nervous
Right,
system.
right.
So I think it's great that the parents can be involved and maybe learn and take some of those tools home. Curious, does it work with adults because adults listen to,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. Certainly the cranial. In fact, we see all ages for craniosacral therapy. We see many babies with post delivery who have feeding problems. I have the advantage of being a lactation consultant as well as craniosacral therapist, and we'll combine those things a lot of times. And with feeding, it's very much a symbiotic relationship. And so we can work with the baby who has a feeding problem, but it's always going to be more effective if we can work with the mom at the same time. And so we have, both sides of the equation, because there's nothing more anxiety provoking, other than having developmental concerns about your child. But think about a new parent who has a new baby who's not eating or can't eat effectively. There is so much anxiety that just sometimes working with the parent, the adult, to get their body to relax makes all the difference in how that child's able to feed, whether it's from breast or the bottle.
Yeah, it sounds like we could all benefit.
Absolutely.
Right?
In fact,
Um,
yeah,
yeah,
we,
I would love to know some success stories. I know you probably have a million, but what are one or two that really just kind of stand out for you?
well, of course, my own son, he's my greatest success story. He's, like I said before, he's who prompted me to open my clinic in the first place. But, you know, what I found with him, the magic combination after going through all the anxiety of kind of figuring out, okay, so he, had trouble paying attention and blah, blah, blah. And I didn't want to do medication. Finding the right combination of therapies and continuing to kind of tweak his program as he grew and developed made all the difference for him. As I said before, he was in a Montessori school, so he had the same teacher for 3 years at a time. And the first year was always his most anxious year. So he would come into the clinic. It just happened the school was, 5 minutes away. So I'd pick him up at lunch and bring him down. And one of my therapists would work with him when I wasn't watching, and twice a week. And that worked great for him. And for that whole first year in school, he would do great. And then this, usually about halfway through the second year with the new teacher, he could do things on his own. We could, either go down to once a week, or, he was fine without therapy for periods of time. And then by the third year, he was sailing, and he was super smart. So he just had to feel comfortable where he was to be able to really learn as well as he could. And then it would come time to move into the next level, and we'd start over again. And it went like that until he got into high school. And at that time, we had another, shoe thrown into the fire or whatever. My husband and I at that time got divorced, and it put a huge emotional stressor on him as well as all the rest of us. But he was one of those kids who had a very, very difficult time with change and stress. And so high school presented a whole other, big issue, which resulted in him going to a private boarding school for 2 years, which he really needed. And he kind of found success again and did really well. He ended up coming home for his senior year, graduated a year early, doing an online high school thing, and just, flew through it, because it wasn't the academics that were the problem. It was just the way he felt about himself. For him, he then decided to join the Army, which, of all the things that I could have feared the most, it would be to go into the Army. But he was 18, and it was really important to him. And I think he was looking for a father figure at that time. And he did. And he ended up being a superstar. He learned Arabic. He got selected, because, and this was a kid who hated his Spanish class because, he just didn't want to do it. But he told they were looking for recruits to learn a foreign language. And he said, well, I like foreign languages. And they tested him, and he tested so high, they sent him to Arabic school. And, he found success, but he found it without me, as an adult, because all those years, I think, of doing all the different things that we did, even though, he was oppositional and all that kind of stuff growing up, what I did most of all was just love him. I loved him. I supported him. I also, really provided what he needed in a way that was still, loving. And I can tell you, I cried a lot during those years. There were many professional offices that I sat in and just cried, because I was like, what can I do? What do I do now? And being a parent is the hardest job, as all of us parents know. And you add a child who has, I had 2 boys. They both learned in very, very different ways. And he was my challenge. But I tell you, that child grew up to be the greatest man ever. And, he has many times since then told me how I absolutely did the right thing, and everything I did along the way, So, it's kind of when you're in the throes of it and you think you'll never, ever hear anything like that, there is hope, way down the line, for those, that kind of affirmation that you really are doing the right thing. If you're coming from your heart and you're there for them, and you're watching and you're listening, and you just do the best you can, and, my, I have a saying here, on a wing and a prayer, we can get there, but it takes a lot of people, and But there are lots of options out there, and you just can't stop looking. Just look for whatever works the best for you all.
Yeah. Yeah, that's wonderful. So much for sharing that. That kind of, yeah, from one mother's heart to another.
Yeah,
When you hear your child give you the affirmation that, we're judged a lot as
that's
mothers,
yeah.
children with challenges, yeah. And then to have your child come back and tell you that's beautiful, and it's healing, and other moms need to hear that. So I really appreciate you sharing that with
And then
our.
he's got these two little girls, and to see him as a dad, and to feel like, I mean, he's so empathetic, and one of them's probably going to need a little therapy. She's the, she's going to give him a run for his money.
Yeah.
But he's been there, and I like to think I made his world a little bit better, because of all of his experiences. And I would say all the kids that we work with all have similar stories. I've been doing this long enough now that, especially at Christmas time, when we're out with the family having dinner, I'll have parents come up to me at the table and just say, "Do you remember me?" And they're there with their kids who are now adults, and doing something remarkable, for themselves. I had a family who had their daughter ended up being a sommelier, and she was really good with wines, and smelling, had all things going for her, and she was happy. She found her niche, and found another family ran into their son when he was a little boy was eating furniture.
Oh
I'm
my.
not kidding. It was really had a hard time. And the pediatric neurologist we were working with at the time, she didn't believe in the craniosacral therapy. And she said, if you can get him to stop eating furniture, I will definitely believe in it. And you know what? We did. And he stopped eating furniture. And it was primarily because of the cranial work and releasing all this tension around his mouth. But he grew up to be a truck driver, and he loves it. He has got this big truck, and he's happy. It was his journey. That's where he ended up. He found something where he could be self-sufficient and happy, and his parents were really supportive of that. And so sometimes it's not up to us to choose what our kids turn out to be. It's where they find themselves, and having the options to be successful. And options is a big thing, is being able to explore different things and find where it is that you're going to land. We all we do the things we do as adults because of the summation of our experiences as kids and growing. And I think if we can find whatever it is that really makes us truly happy, that's pretty incredible. That's kind of our jobs, I think, as a parent, is to allow our kids to grow into whatever it is that's going to help them be the happiest.
Yeah, I'm going to have to amen that, because I think that's the key, right? Is we want our kids to be happy, and we want them to find their own way, just like we did. Struggles does not equal, forever and ever and ever, right? It's
That's
just
right.
part of the growth. And I love those stories. Furniture. That's the first time I've ever
It
heard
was,
that one.
I have to admit he's probably, I've seen many, probably thousands of children by this time, but he's my only little furniture eater.
Well, I think that is for our listeners, just when you think, your child is above and beyond whatever, there you go. You never know what other people's stories are. So it's so important to share them.
Right.
And you wrote a book called When Kids Fly. I would love to know more about it. I know a little bit, Solutions for Children with Sensory Integration Challenges. So let's talk about this book, When Kids Fly.
Well, that was my first book that I wrote.
Okay.
And I wrote that, again, for parents, like, I was, but from a therapist perspective of, all the different kinds of therapies that I had found to be really effective at that time. And it was just, it was a fun book to write. My latest book, which is Sensory Solutions, Drug-Free Therapies to Realize Your Child's Potential, that is an expansion of When Kids Fly. And it, with COVID, we saw so many more problems with children developmentally. And you can imagine why. I mean, kids who had maybe a little bit of social anxiety now had huge social anxiety. They had to interpret the world, with a mask, and all you had was eye expression. How do you how do you interpret the world that way, especially if your sensory systems aren't working well? We saw a huge increase in babies with kind of regulation problems. And, a lot of it had to do with in COVID, moms were, having their babies and sent home like almost immediately with no education or follow-up because of, the risk of COVID. And what ended up substituting it was being over swaddled. So these babies went home and were told to swaddle, tightly their little babies. And nobody knew or told them that you can't swaddle a baby for months. You don't want to swaddle a baby for months. They need to be able to move. And if they can't move, they can't integrate their primitive reflexes. And so we were seeing all these babies with developmental delays and movement patterns and not, even crawling by the time they were 11 or 12 months because they had been over swaddled. So, my latest book is really kind of starts at the beginning with, these are things how you can, prevent some of these things from happening. Plagiocephaly or flattening of the, head was
Mhm.
another big one because they were swaddled. They were, put in containers where they were on their back. And so they, get these nice flat heads, and then they need a cranial helmet, to support it, to help, round it back out. And it can be totally prevented. Plus the craniosacral therapy, even if you're starting to get some of that molding, can, really help turn that around without having to have a cranial helmet. So there were lots and lots of things, starting from newborns all the way through to concussions, which if you have a concussion, it throws you back into a sensory integration crisis. And so a lot of the same things we use for our children with sensory motor, sensory integration, autism, developmental, disabilities applies to somebody with a concussion, because your vestibular system and your tactile system and your, auditory and your visual system all can become disrupted from a concussion. So anyway, that's the latest book has more in it than When Kids Fly, but When Kids Fly was my fun first book to write.
So for our listeners, would you, if you get both books, you're benefiting either way?
You're
It's
benefiting either way. If you're going to choose one, I would choose the latest one.
okay. Okay. Because I can just imagine, listening and thinking, okay, she has two books.
Where do I start?
Which one, which
Yeah.
one would I benefit the most from? And so thank you for answering that, because I'm sure both are important, but yeah, if you're going to have to choose one, that would be the one sensory solutions.
Well, they both cover sensory integration and lots of different therapies.
Uh-huh.
Just the sensory solutions covers a lot more
Okay. I
because
understand.
we have the concussion and we have the, if you have a new baby and you're wanting to, set them up for success, and also more therapies that we're doing now where we weren't doing those when I wrote the first one.
Gotcha. Where can our listeners find your books?
You can find it on upledger.com under resources. They sell them both there. There's also, on Amazon, both bookstores, it's available. So, um, Yeah, and on the Upledger website, they also have, if you're interested more in the craniosacral therapy, they've got
Mhm.
lots of good resources on craniosacral therapy and classes that you can take and that kind of thing.
So our folks that are listening are going to want to know where they can get in touch with you.
Uh, well, we have a clinic in Dallas, Texas. It's called Integrative Pediatric Therapy. The website is iptkids.com. We also have a concussion practice, which is concussion-therapy.com. So if you've had a concussion and you're interested in sensory integration, then you can look at that as well. One last thing about the concussion and why that ties in is so many of our kids with developmental disabilities have coordination problems. So they're
Mhm.
more set up for a concussion, and they may have been scooting, along doing just fine, but they have a concussion and all of a sudden things are looking a lot more pronounced. So it's really good to understand that connection on how you can help support kids early on to be more coordinated, and protect them from, having injuries that can, potentially put them at greater risk, for more problems as they grow and are adults.
Yeah, that's very interesting. That's the first time I've heard that concussions, are in that spectrum, right? Of the therapy and the whys and the understanding of it. But that is really, really great information
Yeah, thanks.
and so important to know.
It is, it really is. And you think about it, if you have a developmental disability and you fall off your bike and get a concussion, it's very easy to ignore some of those symptoms that may be very apparent, but you might just think, oh, it's just, who they are.
Hmm.
Or you have, a child who, has been doing okay, but maybe they needed some tutoring early on, or they had some support, you know, third, fourth grade, fifth grade, and now they're in, playing football in junior high, and
Hmm.
they have a concussion, and now their grades are dropping, and
Hmm.
they're having trouble processing things at school. It's important to recognize there's a connection there, and that there are things that we can do, that definitely you don't want to ignore, that you can address to help have a full recovery, before they end up really feeling like they're a failure.
Wow, that is so important because I just think back, think about all the people who have concussions
Right,
from sports or from whatever, like you said, just falling down.
right. And how they end up, not wanting to, it's hard to study, it's hard to focus, hard to pay attention, and you get behind, and then it's harder to catch up. And,
Yeah.
back in the not so old days, it used to be, you know, people just ignored it. It was just like, get over it. You
Yeah.
need to get to work. And,
Yeah.
and that, can really work against you and work against your recovery. But likewise, not doing anything can work against you too. So,
Mhm.
having the right kind of guidance in your recovery, from a concussion, it's a different etiology, but it's the same. We need to work with the vestibular systems and the visual system and your proprioception and how everything, works together. So you don't have another injury and make things even worse.
Yeah, that is such great, great information because I, have gone all the way through this part of my life
Yeah.
without really making that connection. So that's one of the reasons, this podcast is all about knowledge, hope, and inspiration. And you have really hit all three of them very well.
Oh, good. I'm so glad.
Yeah, yeah. I can tell that you're one of those people that I get to meet that I could talk to all day long because I'm sure I just feel like I need to be taking notes.
Uh,
You're a wealth of knowledge, so many great, hopeful, and inspirational stories that you shared. So thank you for that because I am sure that when our listeners hear this interview, they're going to feel lighter and more confident and inspired from this interview.
Well, my parting words are just don't give up. There is help out there. There are lots of people, who are there to help. Sometimes you have to look a little harder.
Yeah, yeah.
Knowledge is power. So, it's great that you have a podcast that's able to share so much information, and really that's where it starts, is learning. So
It is. And to know that it's not, these struggles are not, you don't stay in the fight or flight, right? We're not going to live there forever.
right.
So I think that's important to hear too, if you're at the beginning of this journey.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much for being on A Mother's Guide Through Autism. And I would love to have you back. I'm sure you have
I'd
so
love
much
to.
more that you can share with us.
I'd be more than happy to anytime. Just let me know.
All right. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And if you listeners out there, if you enjoyed this interview, please please share our information, our podcast, to get to as many people as we can, to spread autism awareness, knowledge, hope, and inspiration. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.
Thanks so much.